A raw silence hung over the mountain pass before dawn, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The air felt impossibly thin and brittle, each inhalation a razor's kiss on the lungs. In the pale pre-light, the jagged ridges of granite and snow stood out in ghostly relief against a leaden sky. At first, only a whisper of wind brushed across the bare rock, so faint that a lingering snowflake drifting free from an overhanging crag seemed to herald the storm's approach. But almost before the eye could follow it, that whisper grew into a low, distant howl, as though the very bones of the mountain were groaning under an unseen weight. Dark clouds swirled in fast, ominous spirals, smothering the rosy flush of dawn beneath a blanket of iron grey. At the ridgeline, the first tussocks of drifting snow leapt into the air, riding the updrafts like frantic spirits seeking escape. Each gust knocked shards of ice against exposed faces of rock, etching fleeting crystalline patterns in the thin morning light. The temperature plummeted by the second. Even the sturdiest patches of pine, weighted with the first winter's snow, trembled under the assault of wind that seemed to carve hollows in the very trunks. Below, the old pines and spruce, sentinels of these slopes, bowed their heavy boughs to the storm's will. Needles shook loose like green embers, spinning upward only to be swallowed by the relentless grey. Where each branch cracked under the strain of burgeoning ice, a hollow echo rolled across the ravine, swallowed immediately by the gale. Even the trickle of a nearby creek, swollen with thaw water from a warmer night, was reduced to a thin thread of hiss, its course hidden beneath a newly forming sheet of frozen crust. As the wind sharpened into a gale, the first true flakes began to descend. Wide, heavy puffs that struck like feathers but clung like glue. They tumbled in drifting curtains, erasing footprints and carvings in the old snowscape almost as quickly as they fell. The stone cairns left by generations of travellers seemed to dissolve into the whiteness, their dark shapes fading until only the faintest silhouette remained. A lone rock cairn at the pass's crest, once a beacon for lost hikers, now stood at risk of being buried altogether, its purpose erased by this sudden assault. Higher still, where the mountain's spine pierced the clouds, streaks of storm snow gathered in bluish-black plumes, whipped into roiling columns that swept across the windward slopes. They collided with hanging glaciers, sending cascades of powder down into hidden gullies. The valley below, normally a patchwork of frozen ponds and frost-silvered meadows, vanished under a shifting fog of blowing snow, a treacherous sea of white that spelled danger for anyone caught upon its crest. With each passing minute, the storm's voice grew louder. A cacophony of roaring wind, whistling passages through narrow chasms, and the distant crack of ice fracturing. Overhead, flocks of ptarmigan and hardy ravens had vanished before the tempest, their wings no match for the gale. Even the silent rock face seemed on edge, as though anticipating some terrible shift, a collapse of snow or stone that would tumble down to claim the unwary. In that transforming landscape, colours drained away until everything existed only in shades of white, grey, and black. The sky and ground merged where visibility dropped to mere feet, and the horizon dissolved into a swirling curtain. A pale glow, the last remnant of the sun's promise, flickered behind the cloud bank but offered no warmth, only an eerie, diffused light that deepened the sense of isolation. By the time the wind reached its crescendo, the mountain pass had become a living thing, an ever-shifting labyrinth of snowdrifts and hidden chasms, where a single misstep could vanish in a buried hollow. Rocks jutted like the spines of some ancient creature, ice-coated and menacing. The scent of ozone, sharp and biting, mingled with the cold, metallic tang of alpine air. Frost formed on every surface, in a lace of frost flowers, delicate and beautiful, yet destined to shatter at the gentlest touch. In that moment, the world of the mountain felt both majestic and malevolent. The storm's fury was a reminder that nature's grandeur is inseparable from its indifference to human frailty, and that any traveller caught unawares in its heart must rely on something beyond maps and compasses. Deep in the howling wind, a single note of life persisted. The steady pulse of the storm itself, insistent and unrelenting, gathering strength to engulf every trail, every marker, until only the tempest remained. The afternoon chill had already stiffened into a deep, bitter cold by the time the hiker realized he was truly alone. He had set out that morning with bright hopes, blue skies, breath visible in gentle puffs, the promise of sunlit summits, but the snowstorm arrived without warning, swallowing trails and landmarks alike in its blinding swirl. Now, with dusk hours away, yet darkness pressing in from all sides, he stood amid a sea of white so uniform that even his own footprints had vanished within minutes. Every direction looked the same. A ghostly expanse of wind-blown drifts, punctuated by the occasional dark silhouette of a jagged rock or a bent juniper struggling beneath the snow's weight. His breaths came in stuttering gasps, each inhalation burning his lungs as he fought the urge to collapse and slide into unconsciousness. The temperature had plummeted so that the moisture on his goggles froze into a milky frost, obscuring whatever meager visibility he clung to. He wiped at the lenses and could feel the cold bite through the thin gloves to the raw skin of his fingertips. His boots, once insulated and dry, had filled with snow that melted against the warmth of his body, leaving his socks sodden and amplifying the sting at his toes with each step. He shook his legs, trying to force warmth back into his rigid calves, but the effort only sent fresh waves of icy pain racing up his shins. He had packed an emergency bivy sack and a small stove, but in the frantic scramble to find shelter, he had dropped the stove's fuel canister somewhere beneath the mounting drifts. Desperation clawed at him as he patted down his pack, searching in vain for the bright orange bag he'd tied to his belt. The wind shredded at the fabric, plucking at the last scraps of warmth from his body. He tried to orient himself by the faint hum of the wind against the ridge, but every gust sounded identical, offering no clue as to which way led back to the trailhead. His compass needle spun uselessly, buffeted by the magnetic interference of the storm. With every step, the crunch of snow underfoot sounded muffled, as if the hill itself was swallowing him whole. His mind flickered between rational thought, keep moving, find a rock overhang, and a creeping haze of disorientation. He counted paces, 50, 100, 200, then reached for another tally only to find his fingers too stiff to grip the pen he carried. Panic threatened to surge, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, focusing on the rhythm, the inhale's white plume in front of him, the exhale's hiss against his frozen collar. Gradually, his heart rate steadied, and the world shifted from chaos to a slow-motion tableau of swirling flakes and half-buried boulders. He knew he needed shelter, anything to buffer the wind's fury. A depression between two outcroppings caught his eye, an indentation barely visible through the white haze. With aching limbs, he staggered toward it, head bowed against the blind lash of snow. Each movement was agony. Every joint screamed as frost began to crystallize along the seams of his jacket. Every muscle threatened to seize. When he finally sank into the shallow hollow, he collapsed onto his pack, toes curled beneath his legs, shoulders hunched to conserve heat. His breath came in rasping wheezes, and he pressed one hand to his neck to feel the pulse there, the only sign that life still pulsed in his waning warmth. As he lay against the cold rock, the world inside his goggles grew dimmer. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the coarse nylon of his bivy bag and the faint promise of warmth if only he could muster the strength to crawl into it. A spark of self-awareness flickered. He could not give in here, could not let sleep claim him in this frozen cradle. With deliberate slowness, he fumbled for the orange sack, the metal carabiner nearly frozen solid in his grasp. His fingers trembled with both cold and fear as he tore it free and unrolled the opening. The wind bit at his exposed face, but he forced himself upward, shoving his shoulders into the sack. The insulated interior offered only marginal relief, yet it felt like a lifeline, a silent promise that he might yet endure until rescue came or dawn broke over the storm's edge. In that fragile refuge, the hiker curled into himself, back pressed to rough stone, breathing shallow and measured. Outside, the storm howled its endless lament. But inside, he clung to the ragged edges of hope, a lone figure huddled against the cold, awaiting the improbable savior who might follow a whisper of sound or a flicker of movement through the white. Abyss. High on the bare branch of an ancient pine, Oliver the great horned owl stirred from his fitful slumber, rousing himself against the whistle of the wind and the restless whisper of snow sweeping across the ridge. Beneath the swirling flakes, his mottled plumage lay still for a heartbeat before his massive wings unfurled in a feathered arc, each soft whoosh muted by the storm's howl. His ear tufts pivoted, swiveling like twin antennae toward the faintest break in the wind's roar, and he lifted his head to survey the world through eyes that saw in twin pools of molten amber. Even as the sleet pounded the knotty bark around him, Oliver's gaze remained unblinking, tracing the dark hollows between rocky knolls and the ghostly outlines of pines bowed under winter's weight. The world below was a shifting, monochrome landscape of white and grey, but to Oliver, it was alive with textures and patterns invisible to human sight. The subtle undulation of drifted snow, the ripple of desperate flight where a meadow vole darted. For cover, the hollow cadence of an elk's distant snort. He rode the updraft with effortless grace, soaring into the grey overhead as though he were carved from the storm itself. Under his broad wings, the snow-laden pines fell away, revealing the scarred face of the mountain in stark relief. With each measured beat of his wings, Oliver quartered the slope, keen talons tucked beneath him, listening for anything that did not belong in nature's lonely hymn. A snap of wood underweight, the hollow thump of falling rock, or the ragged rasp of human breath trapped in the cold. A sudden shift in the pattern of sound made him hesitate. Beneath the rush of the gale, a faint, intermittent rasp, almost like a whisper, slipped through. He banked, angling his silent descent toward a rocky outcrop where the wind funneled into a narrow chute and carried that plaintive note to his ears. There it was again, a weak, choking exhalation that bore no resemblance to the normal symphony of forest life. Oliver dropped like a stone into the swirling vortex, folding his wings to a tight V before easing them open as he closed the last dozen feet. A human form huddled hopelessly in a shallow nook between jagged boulders, half buried in snow, one arm raised in a feeble salute against the wind. His bulky parka was crusted with ice, breath wavering in a thin plume that vanished almost as soon as it emerged. The hiker's eyes, wide with shock and relief, locked onto Oliver's luminous stare, an anchor in the white chaos. From his vantage, Oliver noted the rapid rise and fall of the man's chest, the telltale tremor that spoke of hypothermia's creeping grip. He hovered, wings beating in slow, deliberate strokes that carved a sanctuary of relative calm in the storm's fury, and let out a low, resonant "hoo," a sound meant not to startle but to offer presence and guidance. Then, folding his form small against the gale, Oliver alighted on a nearby ledge, each talon finding purchase on slippery ice as he tilted his head, considering the best way to lead this lost soul back towards safety. In that suspended moment, storm and silence converged around them, and the ancient bond between man and owl, a promise as old as the mountains themselves, fell into place once more. The wind's howl deepened into a keening lament as Oliver glided within earshot of the desperate sounds that had first drawn him from the swirling grey. Beneath layers of lashing snow and ice, a faint, urgent voice emerged, a raspy plea that crackled like a dying ember against the storm's roar. Each syllable was strained and ragged, as though the sender fought to scrape breath through lungs numbed by cold. Oliver allowed himself to hover, wings beating slowly to maintain position against the gusts, talons splayed to catch the shifting eddies. His amber eyes fixed on the narrow chute beneath him, where the rocky walls funneled wind and snow into a furious tunnel. From that throat of stone came the voice again. "Help, please, cold." The words were barely more than a rasp, but to Oliver they were a beacon, more brilliant than any signal fire. He tipped forward, angling his flight into the heart of the gale, and each beat of his wings carved through the frozen air like a blade. The snowstorm's fury seemed to part before him, creating a transient corridor of relative stillness. Below, the hiker lay curled against the lip of a ledge, one arm draped over a knee, the other clutched to his side as if warding off the creeping cold. His breath came in stuttering puffs that vanished the instant they touched the wind. Frost had crystallized along the rim of his face mask, obscuring half his features beneath a glaze of white. His eyes, though wide with shock, locked onto the blur of Oliver's descent as if recognition had sparked in that moment between man and owl. Oliver landed with a muted thud on a nearby crag, snow spraying in slow arcs from his talons as he settled. The man's voice faltered into a choked whisper of relief, and he lifted a trembling hand toward the bird. a futile salute to the strange savior who had pierced the storm's heart. Oliver responded not with another call, but with a deliberate tilt of his head, eyes bright with intent. He turned, lifting himself onto the edge of the ledge, and beckoned, if an owl's subtle body language could be called that, toward a slightly lower shelf he had noted on his approach. Even as the wind threatened to wrench him from his perch, Oliver maintained his calm, an anchor of solidity in the shifting white. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes as the hiker forced himself to rise, each movement an act of sheer will against the cold that numbed his muscles. He inched toward Oliver's chosen foothold, boots crunching against hidden ice, and Oliver shifted forward, hopping from jagged rock to frost-laden pine stub as if inspecting the safest path. With each hop, the man followed, pressing his frozen fingertips against the sheer cliff face for balance, trusting the owl's keen judgment rather than any map or compass. Above, the storm raged, but below it, a fragile alliance formed. A human clinging to the promise of life, and an owl bearing the timeless skill of a mountain sentinel. As they progressed, Oliver paused at intervals, turning to ensure the man stayed within view, then darting ahead to test each tenuous step. Snow drifted through the narrow crack where they climbed, and the man's breath sounded ragged in the hollow caverns of the rock. Yet each step brought them closer to the faint glow Oliver had spotted earlier, a sliver of lantern light perhaps, or the break in the clouds where starlight touched the ice. With that distant promise flickering before him, the hiker found new strength, and Oliver, sensing hope's fragile glow, pressed on into the whirling storm, wings outstretched and eyes unblinking, leading the way through the frozen void toward a salvation borne on silent feathers. The ridge opened before them in a treacherous sweep, a sheer wall of ice streaked with darker veins, where ancient rock pressed against the frozen veneer. Oliver paused at the edge of a narrow ledge barely wide enough for his talons, golden eyes scanning the shifting snow for any hint of instability. Below him, the hiker crouched, breath misting in ragged plumes, one hand cupped against his chest to still its frantic pounding. The storm, though easing at the margins, still thundered against the ridge like an angry surf, flinging needles of sleet that bit at exposed skin with merciless precision. Yet in this momentary calm, this fragile pocket carved from the tempest, Oliver's presence felt like an unspoken pact. Follow my path, and you may yet live. With a slow, deliberate stretch of his wings, Oliver lifted into the air, barely clearing the lip of the ledge. The hiker watched, chest heaving, and then summoned the will to stand, legs trembling like saplings in the wind. As Oliver banked gracefully to the right, circling back in a low arc, the man understood the invitation. He thrust a gloved hand forward and took a tentative step onto the narrow shelf. Instantly, ice crunched beneath his boot, a warning that the ledge might not support more than a moment's weight. He froze, knuckles white around the ice axe he gripped, as Oliver dipped his head in encouragement. Gathering courage, the hiker edged forward, fingertips brushing the rock face for purchase. Each careful step, heel, toe, heel, carved a new promise in the frozen stone, a shaky lifeline cast in hope. Oliver led them past jagged outcrops glinting with ice crystals, each one catching stray shards of light that pierced the cloud cover. The owl's wings, wide and powerful, cut through the still heavy air with such grace that the world seemed to slow, as though respecting the solemnity of this passage. At one point, Oliver hovered in place, talons lightly gripping a cold basalt knob, and turned his head to ensure the hiker's progress. Below, in a shallow chasm, the wind funneled into a shrill whistle, an obstacle that would have sent any other traveler tumbling back into the pit. Oliver's next move was decisive. With a single powerful beat of his wings, he soared across the gap, landing with perfect poise on the far ledge. The hiker, gazing down at the yawning void, closed his eyes against the vertigo, then steeled himself and leapt, feeling the free fall catch him like a sudden embrace before his boots crashed against solid ground. As they pressed onward, the temperature crept upward by degrees that barely registered but brought a subtle comfort, a promise that the worst of the storm lay behind them. Frost had formed intricate lacework across the rock, delicate patterns that glinted like stained glass in the dim light, until every surface was a tapestry of ice. Oliver followed a route that wound around a colossal boulder, its jagged edges scoured smooth by centuries of wind and snow. The hiker's thighs trembled, his muscles woken by the constant strain. But each time doubt crept in, Oliver would glance back, a silent affirmation that they were not alone. Between the man's ragged breaths, he realized that the owl's keen senses had sensed weak spots in the ice, hollow sounds echoing beneath where the surface might fracture under weight. Following Oliver's unerring guidance, he sidestepped hidden dangers that might otherwise have collapsed into fatal traps. At last, as Oliver swept upward toward a higher perch, the hiker recognized the outline of a faint trail cutting into a gentler slope. The path was shallow, but its curve suggested the route led back toward the timberline where rescue parties could search. Oliver sailed ahead in a triumphant loop, then glided down to alight on a snow-laden branch of a stubborn spruce, its needles half buried in white. He cocked his head, eyes bright with satisfaction, as if to say, "This is your way now." The man, sweat mingling with frozen tears, stumbled forward, boots breaking fresh drifts, and felt the first real surge of warmth in his chest. Not from his parka or layers of gear, but from the fierce spark of gratitude and relief. The storm had not spared them, but with Oliver's steadfast lead, they had turned a desolate wasteland into a corridor of salvation. Each step a testament to the silent bond between man and the watchful owl who refused to let him perish in the frozen waste. The wind had eased to a mournful whisper by the time Oliver led the hiker up onto a broad, gently sloping bench of snow-crusted rock. Each labored breath the man drew sent little puffs of ice crystals dancing before his face, and his legs trembled so fiercely that he had to lean against the cold stone to stay upright. Yet whenever he faltered, the great horned owl would turn in place, talons gripping the rim of the ledge, and regard him with those unwavering amber eyes, a silent command to press on. With each measured step, the hiker felt the sting of frost-nipped cheeks give way to a fierce determination. He remembered the phrase he had once read in a climbing manual: "When the mountain breathes its hardest, breathe harder still." So he inhaled, exhaled, and followed Oliver's wings as they swept in a gentle arc toward a distant glow. At first, the light was nothing more than a pinprick against the swirling grey, an ember faintly pulsing through the haze, like a lantern glimpsed through a fractured window. But as they descended, the glow grew stronger, warming the pale snow with a honeyed tint that spoke of fire and shelter. The wind, once a merciless blade, now seemed content to press against their backs, as if even the storm recognized this easterly beacon as a promise of rescue. Beneath them, a narrow ridge led down toward a cluster of skeleton pines whose bowed branches formed a natural corridor. Oliver alighted on the lowest bough, head tilted in encouragement, and the hiker forced himself to follow, stepping carefully where the wood had been shorn free of ice by passing winds. Between the pines, they came upon the source of the light, a weathered emergency cabin, its small window aglow with lantern oil that crackled like a hearth. Smoke curled from a short chimney, dark against the snow-laden roof, carrying with it the scent of burning spruce, so pungent and comforting that the hiker nearly wept aloud. He shuffled forward on knees stiff as boards, each movement guided by Oliver's steady presence. When at last he reached the door, the owl dipped his head in a solemn nod, then drifted down to perch above the threshold. Inside, two mountain rescuers, bundled in insulated parkas and headlamps, rushed forward with steaming mugs of broth and reached out gloved hands to haul the shivering man into the warmth. Oliver watched for a moment, his feathers ruffling in the soft glow as the rescuers wrapped the hiker in a thick thermal blanket and checked his pulse. The man's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his cheeks burned red beneath the spray of melted snow. But each sip of broth brought colour back into his eyes, and he managed a shaky grin at the sight of his feathered guide standing guard in the doorway. One of the rescuers knelt to stroke Oliver's head and murmured, "We owe you our lives, friend." The owl blinked once, then stretched his wings in a slow, dignified arc, as if accepting the gratitude while remaining ever vigilant. Outside, the storm clouds finally broke, revealing a sliver of pale sky where dawn's first rosy tendrils unfurled across the peaks. Oliver lifted into that emerging light, circling once above the cabin before heading back toward the dark ridge from which he had come. The hiker, now supported between two rescuers, followed the owl's flight with grateful eyes, knowing that without his silent sentinel, he would have been lost to the mountain's indifferent fury. As the sun's rays pierced the last veils of storm, the bond between man and owl, sealed by shared struggle in the blizzard's heart, shone brighter than any lantern, a testament to hope found in the most unlikely of guides. When first light crept over the mountain's jagged crest, it found the hiker wrapped in the gentle warmth of wool blankets and the steady hum of rescue radios echoing across the snow. Inside the cabin, the rescuers worked with quiet urgency, testing pulses, replacing damp clothing with dry layers, and offering hot broth that steamed like a promise of life. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward the doorway, where Oliver the great horned owl perched with solemn dignity, talons gripping the lintel and eyes reflecting the rosy glow of dawn. He had guided the man through the storm's wrath, and though he was a creature of wild solitude, he seemed to understand that this moment belonged to both predator and prey, hero and survivor. Outside, the storm had retreated into the night's memory, leaving behind a landscape washed in fresh powder. Icicles hung like crystalline chandeliers from the cabin's eaves, and the scrub pines bowed gracefully under their weight. The rescuers had cleared a path through the drifted snow to the ridge trail, and now their footprints led to where the hiker, still shivering, stood on unsteady feet. He blinked against the sharp clarity of the morning, arms held out as if to embrace the sunrise itself. Oliver watched him for a moment, head tilting at the slightest movement, before lifting into the pale sky, wings outstretched in a silent farewell. As the owl vanished into the pale canvas of dawn, the rescuers guided the hiker toward the low outbuilding that served as the staging point for the final leg of his descent. There, a four-wheel drive snowcat waited, its engine growling softly beneath a blanket of frost, to carry him down to the valley floor. Each bump of the suspension through the half-buried trail jolted him, but he pressed a grateful hand to his heart, feeling the steady beat within. When they crossed the threshold into the warm glow of the medical tent at base camp, the gathered faces erupted in relieved cheers. Family members and friends, awakened before dawn by the promise of hope, crowded around to embrace him, voices choked with tears and laughter. Minutes later, as he sat propped on blankets in the tent's soft light, the hiker described his guide. An owl so majestic and sure that he felt as if nature herself had reached down and lifted him from the brink. He spoke of the moments when exhaustion and cold had nearly claimed him, how each turn in the ledge, each careful step, had been illuminated by Oliver's presence. Those listening leaned forward, eyes wide, as though hoping another glimpse of that silent guardian might appear. And though the storm had buried them in white oblivion, it also had revealed a bond between species that transcended fear and instinct. In saving a human life, the owl had woven a new story into the fabric of the mountain's legends. When the hiker was finally strong enough to stand, he climbed to the edge of the tent's flap and peered into the pale morning. The wind was calm now, carrying only the soft murmur of thawing snow. For a long moment he simply stood, eyes scanning the distant ridges where Oliver had soared, talon to talon with the storm. Then, with a steadying breath, he turned back to the faces of those who had waited and shared his journey. "We owe him everything," he said, voice thick with awe. "He showed me the path when every map and compass failed." In the days that followed, the tale of Oliver's rescue spread through mountaineering circles and small mountain towns alike. Cabin owners left fresh jugs of water and scraps of venison by their doors for any owl who might pass. Guides spoke of looking skyward with newfound respect, listening for the soft whoosh of wings against the wind. And high on the ridges, when the snow fell and the world slipped into white silence, those who knew the story imagined Oliver gliding through the chill air, silent sentinel, feathered angel, ready to answer any cry for help that drifted on the breath of a storm.